Welcome, gals and guys. I and others, I guess. Um, Sorry to laugh. I guess it is what it is. We live in the world we live in. I don't know what to say. Tyrants running amok, lying to children. Lots of false positives. People getting just lost in the sauce because our leaders teach trivial shit rather than relevant things. Like, they don't talk about information. They don't just like share information. They just repeat the same talking points. Anyway, pardon me. This though is a Ammonite, specifically late Cretaceous Ammonites, talk by Josh Slattery, I guess. Slattery. I don't know. Pardon me. Let's close these. I took pictures, so let's just go ahead and go by the pictures. Pretty much every picture is a slide. I think I took a picture of every slide in this presentation. So, introduction to Ammonites. They're called Ammonites because the god Ammon, who had horned, or it depicted it with horns, which maybe has a relationship to the concept of Ammonites, in that they're not fossils, they're actually caused by current flows that are eddies that then are much more fundamental to the nature of reality than just a creature in the ocean would have been, so to speak. Like, sharks aren't fundamental to the nature of reality. Deer, like animals, living creatures, sure, like they're part of reality, but they're not like the building blocks, although maybe it could be argued in some way, across scales, they become the building blocks in some way. But ammonites are much more the actual building blocks, the iterative fundamental particle that repeats itself across scales. That is the atom, that is the solar system, that is the galaxy, that is the ammonite. Okay, so this presentation, we're going to go into the details that are brought up. Josh Slattery is quite knowledgeable on ammonites, and this was a good presentation. He's presenting interpretation, modern science, so like my criticism is not at all with him, but with modern science and its interpretations and its excuses. The only thing, it really gets away with the things it gets away with because there's not a counter interpretation that's really taken seriously. Previous interpretations were like snake stones, where it was like a snake, and there is elements of snake in current flow paths, like there's snakes everywhere on Earth, in the Earth, like along the western coast of North America. There's two prominent, the most blatant ones are the ones going from up this way with a head here and down this way with a head here. Maybe it's a little more visible here. These ones are the most blatant. So snakes are really related to currents, so in some sense, snakestone is more accurate. It's certainly more accurate than calling it a living creature when it never was. But let's check out what Josh said. Reproduction. Maybe we can get to a slide that maybe talks about reproduction. I'm not sure. One of the critical features of differentiation between Nautilus and Ammonite shells is, first, this last chamber is huge relative to the Ammonite. Second, the siphuncle is in the middle in the Nautilus, where in the Ammonite it's at the boundary. And then thirdly is the sutures. Sutures, which I've been calling dendrites. Maybe I need to begin to call it sutures. I'm going to begin to call it sutures because that's the actual term typically applied to it. The suture zones, these are much more complex in ammonites, and we've talked about this many times, how there's current flows going from generally like the center here and wrapping around to the other side that are flowing in like spokes around the wheel of the ammonite. It's not quite a wheel, but in spoke forms around the ammonite. And the suture zones, these sutures are formed by the current flow around the wheel of the ammonite being caused to bend under pressure and occupy the space, fill the space. One second. Okay. So that's the thing going on with these suture zones. And then this is the depiction of an ammonite, which it never was a living thing, but interestingly, as I mentioned before, a different talk brought it up. They're not actually considered related to the nautilus as much as they are considered related to squid and octopi and something else. And the reasons we'll get into. This is one of the reasons. One of the reasons that ammonites are considered different than nautilus is the so-called reproduction, the eggs. These are supposedly ammonite eggs, which really makes me think of this picture from diamond miner Ivins, where the ammonite has eggs, perhaps. These are more disc-like, but these other ones are smaller, so maybe they're more able to form spherically in appearance. If they're even related to ammonites, I mean, I imagine that they've been closely tied to ammonites to a point where they're related to ammonites. Whereas, so they, though, according to modern science, would hatch much faster than the nautilus. Like the nautilus is about 6 months to a year for hatching. Ammonites were considered to hatch much faster. I believe one of the reasons is because of the extinction of the ammonites. Also, like finding things like this, but then the extinction of the ammonites needs explained because nautilus didn't go extinct. So because nautilus didn't go extinct, there must be a reason, and the reason, one of the main reasons that's concluded is that the nautilus had eggs that lasted long enough that they could survive the KT boundary. Extinction event of the so-called impact at Chicxulub by a asteroid, or whatever you want to call the object, but impacted at Chicxulub. Okay, let's keep going though. So, octopi and the squid have millions of eggs. So that's one of the reasons they're more closely related to ammonites, according to modern science. Where nautilus have, first of all, larger eggs, which then means more energy, that they're less abundant. Where ammonites supposedly had smaller eggs that are less energy investment. Okay. Ammonite eggs discovered, ammonoid eggs discovered here, supposedly. I'm going to have to look into the eggs more. Live fast, die young. Most ammonites lived 2 to 3 years. This is according to modern science, based on isotopes. and then said to be similar to coleoids. So that's the other one. I'm not even sure what that is. Coleoid. So I guess squids and other things. One of the two subclasses of cephalopods. Okay, let me see what this next slide says. So here we see nautiloid is separate from ammonite, which is then more closely tied to these three according to interpretation, which are then like octopi. Another thing, biostratigraphy, of course, the fact that it's used for biostratigraphy, even though it's not bio at all. It's just in the stratigraphic column, and it's discoverable that there is a time when they were most prevalently being formed by currents in certain shapes, like conditions changed. And so the outcomes changed. It wasn't really like a species evolving at all. It was, or many species evolving into other species of ammonites. It wasn't like that. It was that the physical flows of the currents were changing in terms of the circumstances, like the oxygen present, the depth of the water, the just pressures, the materials within the flows that were then being like concentrated into these structures to form them. All sorts of aspects that lead to a wide array of outcomes that really points to they're not fossils. Okay, let's keep going though. For the Cretaceous, probably the best record is in North America, whereas Jurassic is in Europe. I thought that was very telling. I'm kind of curious. I'll try to find information of that nature. Maybe this paper right here he references, this report, might be worth really looking into further. There's got to be somewhere to find where ammonites were at which times and what the like boundaries of their zones are on enough of a like widespread scale to really see global ripples of currents, like where the energy was being concentrated and like colliding. So like it was in the Jurassic more so happening in Europe, but then that moved to North America in the Cretaceous, which then led to ammonites forming throughout the Cretaceous more so in North America, is what I'm thinking, and etc. Like wherever they're at a given time points to a process is happening. The seaway shrunk between the Campanian to the Maastrichtian due to the formation of the Rockies, which is part of the process of the flood that we've been talking about. Geologic evidence of where there was a physical body of water here flowing in an eddy that formed an ammonite here that then abutted basically currents over here. So their interactions squeezed the Rockies. So the seaway shrunk in the time of the uplift, maybe because it was just building a mound and forcing current out over here more and more, as well as over here and up here and everywhere really, over through the Rockies out here in Bart. Diversity outside of the western interior seaway is much higher. So like there's way more so-called species elsewhere than where things were really building up to, it's almost like a macroscopic, like the more it becomes macroscopic, the more it becomes one thing repeated over and over, like pixels that look very much the same. So with a higher energy going on over here, perhaps, is my thought, more energy equals more abundance but less diversity. So like elsewhere, there's not as many, but there's a wider spectrum of ammonites forming, of different so-called species, because the circumstances are more like across a spectrum rather than being like, even though it's still across a spectrum in North America, that spectrum is just getting like more spaced apart, kind of like the difference between the space between solar systems and the space between galaxies. Like the more energy input involved, the larger they become, so the more space they become. But also in terms of like the more they fit into like one category as that happens, like those are all galaxies. And the spectrum of masses that a galaxy can be composed of is much higher of a absolute spectrum than the spectrum of atoms. But really, those are all galaxies, yet there are many elements of the periodic table. That kind of thing is going on, I think, with a diversity, low diversity in North America compared to elsewhere, but high abundance compared to elsewhere of the ammonites. I'm going to try. So this is North America during the late Cretaceous, the Seaway, which we talked about. Habitat hypotheses, so squid, nautilus. I think this is at the top, like generally surface region, high in the water column, and then bottom dwelling, and then migrating between top and bottom, like physically going up and down in the column. These kinds of things point to me to like energy aspects of the ammonite formation when it comes to ammonites and nautilus, in terms like especially the extinct species of nautilus that I'm not even sure ever were as well. I just haven't looked into them to really like disagree beyond just being like suspicious of the conclusion from what I know. Okay, let me just keep going. Ammonites yet to show vertical migration based on isotope differences. So there's no evidence that ammonites moved up and down in the water column, which if it's forming in an eddy, that's like based on a chamber being there, like some kind of like pressure holding it in place, basically, it would make sense for it to not really show vertical migration. Typically, all you find is fossilized shells, so this is another like red flag. Also, you don't find broken pieces of fossilized shells like contained in a matrix unless it's a slice. Like, yes, you find entire chunks, like a chunk of an ammonite, but you don't find like just the top portion of the shell, like pieces of shell, pieces of ammonites that are clearly just were broken and then contained in a matrix and then fossilized. That doesn't happen. If mixed with other fossils, so we mentioned mixed with other fossils and like the presence of other fossils near ammonites. and how that is used to suggest various diets of the ammonite. Ammonites probably did not float around much after they died, sunk within a few hours. It's so weird to think about. Radular structure near jaw. So one of the characteristics studied is the jaw structure. I believe this is the jaw structure. Not completely sure. They found tiny crustaceans in the supposed gut, but if ammonites are forming by current flows, these so-called tiny crustaceans may also have been the result of current flows, where it just looks biological. It just looks that way without considering alternatives of current flows, without investigating the path of consideration that they're formed by current flows. It just like leads, oh, there's some type of thing inside of this shell in what we determine to be a gut, and it supports our hypothesis that it's eating these things. So it was eating these things, and really not critically looking at it from opposing angles. It's really looking at it from one angle always. These are obviously fossils, and that's that. And so what is it? What can we learn? And not even like cognizant that there is any other possibility of what they are. Which makes sense. I don't really like blame society for concluding that, but at the same time, it's not true. Then he said grouping ammonites by shell probably doesn't mean much, and instead the jaws are used to differentiate between ammonites. The concept that grouping ammonites by shell probably doesn't mean much is so ridiculous to me. In what world would that make sense? Like, if you found a bunch of creatures that all look the same, would you be like, wait, let's check their jaws? Like, they'd be all the same species. It doesn't take looking at their jaw to determine the differences. But in ammonites, it does. Isn't that weird? That the shell doesn't actually indicate the species. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's a red flag, one of many. Shallow water variants, so I started writing stuff down. Maybe let's go forward some more. So shallow water variants, so that this one here probably evolved from this one. These two on the left are thought to have evolved from this one. The Plany spiral shell form here. During end Triassic, early Jurassic. And then here are some jaws. Supposed jaws. And then this type on the left probably ate plankton and jellyfish. So basically their jaws are really fragile, and so they couldn't have eaten anything other than plankton and jellyfish. So they probably ate plankton and jellyfish. It's really that simple. It doesn't actually mean that's the case. It just means we're interpreting these really fragile structures to actually have been jaws when they weren't. And because of that, the only explanation for a creature having such a fragile jaw is that they ate really subtle foods. And since they're in the ocean, that means plankton and jellyfish. That's the approach. It doesn't make it so. It's just we don't have a better explanation. This one on the top left here was the most abundant in North American biostratigraphy, apparently. And then placenta something or other. So here's their jaws again. Plankton, jellyfish. Here they are again. This one, that's real quick. I noticed this yesterday, right here, like a circle here and around here, like the end of an ammonite spiral this way, across here. That then goes like over this way, maybe to there. Like it kind of reminded me of an ammonite. Maybe that kind of ammonite even. I wonder if these are found like in this area or something. I don't know. Because I was thinking like where these recent ammonite videos I've been doing from Diamond Miner Ivan's videos in Texas. Like there's kind of potential here of maybe an ammonite type shape around in this region, like right here, across here, like an end here maybe. Something in this region could be ammonite, like ammonite here. And then the sage wall, which is I believe right here. Sage wall is over here. So check out my sage wall videos. It's over here somewhere, and it's basically a blocky, naturally formed wall that looks like the surroundings. So it's possible that's a thing that happens where like the large induces smaller scale structures of the same thing, kind of like it spawns them, like the ammonite eggs that we're looking at, but in this case, this one has ammonite eggs that are much more like just ammonites. Maybe they're found like over here even. Something. I don't know. I don't want to like oblige it to be that way, but ammonites, some more. Okay. Life habits. Placenta ceratida. Placenta ceratide. Ceratida? Extinct 6 to 7 million years before the end of the Cretaceous. This one could live in low oxygen. So that's one of the things. Like, because it formed in low oxygen, it could live in low oxygen. But, like, that doesn't mean it lived in low oxygen. If it's a geological process, it doesn't care if there's oxygen or not. It's just geologically occurring. It's not like breathing the oxygen to survive in the same way as a creature. So it will just use what's there, and it will transform that into an ammonite. But if the currents and conditions of pressure, etc., are present, outcome equals ammonite. It doesn't care what the input is, as long as it has something to use that's like can be solidified and so on. So the presence of anoxic in like low oxygen ammonites is a telltale sign, I would say, that they're not fossils. I know things can live in low oxygen conditions, but it just points towards just another check in the box of these are not fossils, and here's why. And these ones seem to come in after the other one before it went extinct, meaning when the system changed, like the conditions changed. So this one, the conditions of the Earth expansion process changed because the Earth was expanding and things were changing. And the outcome is that the systems induced subsequent changed. Okay, so then let's just keep going. This one, I believe, this one here is supposedly preferred deeper water, common in Gulf Coast, even up to late Cretaceous. So that really, this one probably is highly related to like the crescendoing of the Earth expansion process, where it really focused in the Gulf region, so this one was forming at that point. Let's keep going past this one. Baculitide, which is a type of ammonite. Jaws preserve, thinnest jaws of all ammonoids. So this one had even the thinnest jaws. Inside interpretive gut content were, and he even used the phrase interpretive gut content. You mean the gut content or no? Well, that's what we interpret it as. Like it's that bad. That like scientifically, the phrase interpretive gut content is like more appropriate. Pelagic gastropods and small crustaceans, which I don't know enough about to really think about how that's happening from current flows exactly, whether or not it's like something that got lodged in. That doesn't really make sense if it's in the so-called gut. It's probably just nuances unaccounted for from current flows, but I'm not really sure what to make of it. Their most stable position is vertical. Like, that's another thing. There are these huge, long shells. So they like literally try to figure out how they oriented themselves in the water, and the most stable way is vertical. But like, it's just kind of ridiculous. How's this little thing? Like, it's a little thing too. It's got this huge shell, little creature. Like, in some ways, it seems a little out of scale, maybe. I don't know, but let's keep going. Shallow water settings for these. And then here's a similar creature, the oarfish, that they compare it to, and then the squid. So they're comparing this, the baculite, that have these long shells, to these things because these do have like a vertical alignment in how they orient themselves. So like those do it, so there's some evidence of something else doing it. So these baculites maybe did it too. And no one's really resisting us, so our conclusions will fly. Like, it's really that's happening, is there's no resistance to the conclusions. There's no one like, wait, except for maybe people really who look at the shallograms with the Vajrakita interpretation as more valid. The river worm, which is very small population. It's not Certainly not like scientifically done either, so it's much more through a religious lens. So it's just not out there where people are resisting interpretation of ammonites in the same way. So like basically whatever seems to make the most sense just gets to fly without resistance, without it necessarily being valid whatsoever. Like if you really dig in and think about it and look around at the evidence, don't just think, but do think. Scaphotide. These ones are the most abundant ammonite approaching the KT boundary. Stable isotope values very similar to benthic organisms. Probably close to seafloor within a few meters, not moving up or down. What a weird thing for scientists to conclude. You know, these things, they really look like they didn't move from the seafloor. Like, we can tell they didn't move within a few meters of the seafloor. That's so weird. It makes sense for if currents are inducing them, that they'd be happening essentially on the seafloor. Maybe not exclusively on the seafloor, but certainly on the seafloor. But it doesn't really make sense that they wouldn't move more than a few meters from the bottom, especially if they could move. Like, it's not like they're bottom dwelling, like literally on the bottom. They're not like crabs walking on the bottom of the, I mean, like these things, according to science, are moving up and down enough that they, like, why wouldn't this one? It's highly anomalous. Well oxygenated facies, so this did include a lot of oxygen. So it certainly plays a role, but it's just not inherently necessary. It just plays a role in the outcome. And this one, commonly found other groups in geological record are these. The nostoceratide is stable isotope values near sea bottom, shallow marine environment, well oxygenated facies. So it's oxygenated because there's oxygen probably like involved in the outcome in terms of what's seen. Like anoxic ones don't really have oxygen as much. Like the frequency, the percentage of oxygen, like what's going on here maybe is probably skewed in the ones that are anoxic or low oxygen. But then the isotopes indicate near the sea bottom. So that's something cool about ammonites, is that isotopes are involved. Like, and a little weird, like, honestly. Like, it makes sense if they're fractal galaxies, atoms, solar systems, atoms especially, if you think about atoms. Like, that there are stable isotope aspects to their outcome. Kind of makes sense. And then the other one, the Diplo one, we don't know much, probably oriented opening upward. This one on the right, like with the opening up, facing upward. Like, it's kind of like, it's so random. Stable isotope, again, pretty close to the seafloor. And then this one. So, similar to small forage fish is kind of what the interpretation is in squid, rather than nautilus. So here's an image of the different types of ammonites, and I guess them eating shrimp or whatever that is. Whatever they're eating, I don't know. Evidence for predation on ammonites. So this would be pointing to them being actually sea creatures if some other sea creature were to be eating them. However, biting evidence increasingly. One second. What was I saying? Here, scaphatids always have a puncture hole on rear of shell. Or maybe that might be the next slide or so. In this slide. I went a little too far then. Oh yeah, I went way too far. Amanitina. Eating ammonites, evidence for predation. There's actually been a lot of debate about this, is his quote, in terms of what bit them. So maybe it was this one, maybe it was that one, who knows. Not these, but I forget this thing and some other thing. Like, we're just kind of seeing features that look like bite marks. But if you think about it, like, shouldn't it crush the shell? Why is it biting, like, little holes in the shell? If something like this bit an ammonite, it wouldn't just puncture little holes in the shell at its teeth. That makes no sense. If you go bite a seashell, are you gonna puncture, like, little tooth holes, or are you gonna just break it in half if you do anything, or however many pieces? Like, you're not gonna bite little holes in it. It makes no sense if you actually think about it. But what you would do is you would break it. So, like, where are the ones that have, like, breaks that are, like, wiggly breaks that are just breaking from being bitten? And then that is fossilized with all its breaks. Like, none of that is real, because that's not how ammonites form. They're not living creatures that were bitten by other living creatures. Evidence of heel marks, like, so things are biting, like this thing. This thing bit an ammonite, and then the ammonite got away and healed. Or, like, a current flows induced a hole in it and then, like, patched the hole enough that evidence of healing exists. Don't find their body chambers very often. Like the final segments, which kind of relates to that the final shells, the final chambers become more detached from the, like, nucleus and more easily able to break apart, like radioactive decay. And that final chamber maybe is like a alpha particle, a decay product that repeats itself across atomic observations where there's certain decay products. Like, they're not just decaying any energy, they're decaying, like, discrete packets of certain energies, basically. Okay. Don't find their body chambers very often. You have the septal parts remaining, but the part where the animal's body fit in is totally gone on most of these specimens. So most ammonites don't even have room within them for a creature to have lived, except for the broken end piece that supposedly had the creature in it. Yet another, like, why? Why? Let's keep going. Baculotides. evidence for predation. Again, not very well published on. So he said in the predation instances, it's just not really well published on. There's not that much information because it's probably hard to write some bullshit. It's such bullshit that it really takes like exceptional like cases of pseudo evidence like this one here on the screen that look enough like a bite mark to be labeled a bite mark and get through. Like, even though people want to affirm their belief systems, so like the editor of the paper sees it, like there's just not enough evidence. There's literally just not enough evidence for people to like build a case around it, so it's very not very well published on. We do find little puncture marks, and then he goes on to say, actually on both sides, like it's common for the puncture mark to go through. So like that, maybe that's what's going on with the teeth. Oh, it requires a bucktooth fish here, or whatever, to like get through the shell over to the other side. But current flows, like that makes sense. Again, it makes far more sense from a current flow standpoint that they're inducing currents through and literally through both sides. Whereas the teeth biting through both sides, like to a point where it's something that comes up in this lecture, like it must be common enough, like relatively common compared to singular holes, to a point where it's anomalous enough that it came up in this lecture and it's something that people talk about. Baculotides are almost always broken up into pieces, like the separate chambers though, not broken like this way into like chunks halfway that are lodged in the matrix like this, but only broken along the weak points that form where the current was etching in the suture zones. And something to do with that, it's not a spiral and more of just like a column, must have participated in making them generally weaker in the currents as an outcome, where they're just more likely to break apart. Maybe they're more of like jet streams, like gamma ray bursts or something, that then are such streams that they break apart more easily. Reminds me of a video I saw of, let's see if I can find it, on all Twitter. Hose freezing water. This one reminds me of this, like a jet stream coming out of a ammonite, like a gamma ray burst, but then like it enters into a surrounding environment where it's able to do things like this, where it breaks into little pieces. Like something of this nature is probably at play with baculites. Yes, I know this is probably like partially frozen inside the hose and all sorts of things in terms of what is going on in this video. I don't know exactly. It's cool. Like clearly it's freezing. It's vibrating here. Like it's vibrating, which is a little odd if it's like solid ice. Same thing though with these, where there's similar current flows that are then more able to break along this plane and do commonly. Okay. Even though that's maybe not the best, like, parallel to that video. It might be inappropriate to a degree in terms of nuance. Like, maybe it's not because of freezing, like coming out of this like hot nucleus region where this everything's being compacted and then coming out of it into a low pressure, so it like freezes and breaks kind of thing. I don't know. Low temperature and pressure, maybe. Okay, then the next one. This one always have a puncture mark on the rear of the shell. So, literally, the thought is a creature like this would grab the shell, grab the ammonite from behind. The ammonite's going along its business. La la, I'm an ammonite. La la la, look at me, I'm an ammonite. And then this creature comes behind him, because it's always attacking from behind, and punctures the shell from behind. Even though the ammonite is in the far chamber where it's not even reachable from there, it punctures the chamber here repetitively and doesn't learn its lesson. It's like, there's got to be food in there, even though the ammonite's in the final chamber. There's got maybe this one. I might be inappropriately making that sarcastic joke there, and like maybe science would say, oh no, the ammonite was reachable there. But the point being that this systematically happens to a point where they conclude some kind of creature like this is responsible. Where always have a puncture mark on the rear of skull. Always corresponds to where the soft body of the ammonite attaches. That's what it is. So yeah, where the soft body of the ammonite attaches to the internal part of the shell. Imagine you're this like creature here. I mean, this thing is it's like a doctor. It knows a precision where the boundary of the ammonite's soft parts and the like shell boundary is, or current flows know that boundary and systematically have like pressure releases out of it, something of that nature. Okay. Evidence for biting evidence increased greatly towards the companion, which is kind of weird. Like, so let me say this one. Literally. So as we approach the KT boundary, these ammonites start to just, in my interpretation, burst, like gamma ray bursts, jet streams out of them to a point where they form bite marks in a higher frequency, whereas over here, like shell crushers, they're just gone. What happened? Like, nothing's crushing their shells. It's so ridiculous to think that nothing's crushing their shells if it's a living creature. If you find fossils in Cretaceous, likely to be ammonoid. Plankton collapse killed ammonites. So the KT boundary supposedly collapsed the plankton, which then killed ammonites because they had no food, since they have these fragile jaws that can only eat plankton and jellyfish. Small, young, rapid hatch, whereas the Nautilus is a bottom feeder. I'm not sure why ammonites are not, since they're frequently found at the bottom, but whatever. Something else is being debated is fish teeth, rare in geological record before KT boundary. After ammonoids go extinct, fish teeth more prominent over time. This is fascinating to me. Maybe let's go ahead a bit more. Here we go, fish teeth. Approaching the KT boundary, here's some fish teeth. More of them and larger. Like, especially around the KT boundary, they're really large, and then they dwindle off. Is that like, are we sure we know what we're talking about? These are almost undoubtedly Like, if it's actually fish teeth, it's because the KT boundary opened the oceans up, and the process allowed for like the eddies to relieve their pressure. So like, imagine you're a fish and the water is swirling and probably really muddy and things. Like, you're gonna fucking die in those time periods in most places, maybe. And after the KT boundary, the water is not doing that as much, then you're more likely to live, and then the fish grow larger and more larger teeth if it's fish teeth. Whereas it may just be that it's inappropriately misclassified, just like many fossils are. Many fossils are misclassified. Arrows are misclassified frequently, I would say. I've found enough misclassified arrows to know that they're misclassified with a regularity. And same as ammonites, they have no competition. They're just arrowheads, and that's that. But it's not true. Okay, I mean, certainly some of them are, but baculites had no chiral deposits like nautiloids for buoyancy for standing in water. So they didn't have some critical mechanism for standing in water, the like pillar ones. So that's a little weird. So people say they did it by other means that I don't think I wrote down. Something to do with the sutures and how they could refill their chambers more easily based on the sutures, which is interesting. From a current flow interpretation standpoint, is very interesting. I don't know what to make of it. And then Nipponites. Let's just keep going to get done here. I gotta go. Conclusions. Okay. Jaws. In terms of jaws, 3,000 baculites found generally will bring one of them with jaws. 100 scaphatids, well, one of them with jaws in the Maastrichtian Campanian time frame, at least. Never found jaws of earlier times. Argument being, well, they're fragile. Whatever, dudes. And then, require CAT scan to look into internal parts. So that's one of the excuses. Well, there's probably more jaws. It's just they require CAT scan. So are you guys interested in what you're researching or no? Don't you guys have like scientific capacity to do these things? Like, if you're not finding it, maybe it's because it's not true. Alright, I gotta go. Peace out, guys. See you next time. Later.